In late December of 2020, I emptied my locker in the tiny staff room of the school I'd been teaching at in Sydney and told my boss I was quitting my job as a makeup educator. Not only that, I was ending my entire career as a special effects makeup artist after more than 2 decades in the entertainment industry. Even when things were going well, I never felt at home in the world of film and television. I could never quite get enough traction to stick the landing. To be fair, I've probably always had a touch of the tears and just enough of the riz to get me in trouble. What followed was a series of normal 9-to-5s, where I felt even more out of place, like I was squeezing myself into a space I didn't belong. I felt like I'd lost myself. And needless to say, depression kicked in hard and fast, and it lingered. I put on a ton of weight and became immensely antisocial. Hell, I was anti-people. I felt truly lost. I didn't know where I belonged anymore, only that it had to be somewhere I could be creative again. Over the next few years, I realised I needed to work with my hands. I needed to make again. I found the makers community on this very platform and watched countless hours feeding my thirst for creativity. I watched them sculpt and mould and cast and build and glue and Dremel and sand and solder, paint, hairify and flockinate. I felt every resin disaster and celebrated their triumphs. And quietly I thought, pretty sure I can do this. Or at least, really love to try. At the start of 2025, I'd had enough of barely existing. It was time for a change. I lost more than 25 kilos thanks to dieting and weightlifting. I reconnected with distant friends. And finally, I quit my last shitty job and started this crazy, challenging build. Before we get into the build, a quick bit of context. I've always been creative. Like most kids, I started drawing as soon as I could hold a pencil, but while everyone else found a sport or something more prescribed, I just never stopped drawing. People, animals, logos, whatever caught my attention. I drew it all. I was also the weird kid on the block. My mum introduced me to horror movies very early, probably too early. And by primary school, I was getting detention for telling horror stories at lunchtime. But my audience kept showing up, so horror stuck. Games stuck too. From the clunky little blocks plugged into the VCR to Commodore 64 and eventually PlayStation. The idea that I could control a world on a screen blew my mind. And then came Silent Hill. It wasn't like anything else. The awkward dialogue, the music, the sirens, the fog, it all felt deeply unsettling, yet mesmerising. The monsters weren't just scary, they were disturbing. When Silent Hill 2 came out, I played it for 16 hours straight. I was hooked. When the remake was announced, it didn't just make me nostalgic, it lit a fire. I wanted to bring that world out of the screen. I wanted to make something that paid homage to a world that had shaped my love of horror and atmosphere and design. I knew 2 things going into this project. 1, I wanted to make something that acknowledged the new remake, because I really loved it and I really want them to make more, and they are. And 2, it had to suitably house my nurse. I'll get to her in a sec. But the only environment that felt right to me was, of course, Brookhaven Hospital. While searching for inspiration, I found these screen grabs. I really love the composition of this shot with the forced perspective, but I really wanted it to be otherworld with all the rust and debris. So I found a bunch of images of this part and stitched them together in Photoshop to make like a mood board or a treatment. I like going old school when I'm designing a new project, so I drew out a plan with pencil and paper. Not only was I building a diorama for the first time, I decided to make it exponentially harder for myself by not making it a plain old box. Some things like the gurney had to be mixed just due to space restrictions, which is where I discovered my first limitation. Nursey was already made at this point, and I didn't know about scale ratios. I made her to be about 25 centimetres tall. I discovered that my sloped ceiling couldn't be too sloped or she'd look like a hobbit, and I couldn't slope the floor down because I didn't own a foam cutter and I'd probably fuck it up. This wasn't my first sculpting rodeo, but I'd never sculpted a full-body female form or anything at this scale. After wading through dozens of iterations of classic Silent Hill nurse, I happened upon Rodrigo's amazing version of her for Glowstick Entertainment. and I thought she was as close to my vision of what I thought she should look like, or what I thought she should be, despite her not being identical to Silent Hill 2. But in the end, she's my sculpture, and I'll make her how I want to. I want to preface this section by saying I don't have a lot of footage sculpting her. At this stage, making a YouTube video on her build was proof of concept to see if I actually liked doing this. So I watched a bunch of sculpting videos, cobbled together a basic armature out of wire and tinfoil, and managed to bang out a shape in a couple of days. I used Super Sculpey for the flesh as I want to retain some translucency, and spent the next few months refining her shape. In my impatience prior to her very first bake, I forgot to refine her fingers so they look a bit munted. Her hat, shoes and upper dress were all sculpted in Super Sculpey, and the lower half of her dress was sculpted in Cosclay Living Doll in Fairy Light for flexibility. Just prior to her final bake, I managed to drop her and break her arm. I found this sensational skin painting tutorial by Against All Odds figurines, which reminded me of the intrinsic or inside-out painting we used to do in the mines. If you want to see an epic skin painting tutorial, go check out Against All Odds. Link in the description. So I primed her completely white, airbrushed with Temu acrylic paints. God, I love these. I then coated her dress, hat, shoes with latex to protect them from the skin paint onslaught. I did a speckle coat with my airbrush in Temu acrylic red, then a thin coat of pale flesh wash. I went off script from the tutorial as he was making a pretty girl and I was making Nursey. I decided it was time to add some epic veins, lividity, shading and depth to the recesses. These were acrylic alcohol inks in colours that I love working with for dead things. I airbrushed another very diluted coat of pale flesh, which knocked back the veins, but a bit too much. It was time to remove the latex over her clothes and touch up the edges where the latex had overstepped its bounds. Oh, nice. Now, because I thought I'd fuck it up, I didn't film this part, so imagine that I'm using a grunge palette with dirts for spatters and shading on her dress and shoes, followed by a liberal smattering of Citadel's Blood for the Blood Gods and a mix of colours from my Skin Illustrator palette. At a later stage of the build, I decided Nursey's skin looked a little flat and needed a glow up. So I went ahead and enhanced all the shadows with War Paint's red and blue washes and applied Tamiya semi-gloss all over her skin. In my infinite wisdom, I didn't film making her knife, which I sculpted out of Milliput original with a length of armature wire through the centre and painted it with the usual suspects, brown, silver, blood. During my obsessive maker watching fiasco, I got obsessed with abandoned miniatures, and he in turn put me on to the lovely Ara of Bentley House Minis, who gave me the idea to build the diorama out of cardboard first, because, well, I had no idea what I was doing. Ara does know what she's doing, as you will see if you go and take a look at her channel, and she used this cardboard technique mainly for tricky builds. I used it to make a box. From the rough plans I'd made, I measured out the base and the 3 walls and the ceiling and stuck them together with tape. To get the ceiling to angle down, I inserted toothpicks at the various wall heights to rest the ceiling points on. Once I got the rough shape, I wanted to see how the lighting was going to work out, so I cut out some light holes and tested it with some panel lights I had. When everything looked kind of okay, I bit the bullet and decided it was time to move on to the real deal. I was so excited to finally get my chance to work with XPS foam. But in Australia, any foreign request for a material is often met with confusion. Or it takes forever to get here, or it costs an absolute fortune. But despite the complaints, I found a local supplier with my precious foam. Initially, I had designed the base to be 33 centimetres wide at the front and 22 at the back, but the foam that I got was only 30 centimetres wide and, well, maths. So I left it at 30 centimetres at the front and 25 at the back. Next came the surface texture. I wanted tiles to make the floor look less boring, and I had this plastic dessert cup that I used to press tile shapes into the foam. I lined it up in a grid first, just to keep it somewhat neat. I also wanted a rusted, broken away sort of floor section, so I borrowed out an area of the floor and proceeded to scratch it up with my tools. Once I was relatively happy with the floor texture, after making the deep burrows as matte and black as I could, I primed the whole thing with a mix of matte black paint and Mod Podge. I wanted to start getting some of the glorious rust coloration, so I mixed some carbon black paint with some red oxide and burnt sienna, and dry brushed that mix all over the base so that the deeper areas stayed black. I graduated to just red in some areas and just sienna in others for variation. Finally, I dressed the hole and parts of the floor with a combination of my new favourite products in the whole world, Dirty Down Rust and Yellow Rust. This shit is the tits. You have to shake the bottle heaps, but once you have RSI, paint this stuff on and let it dry, it really looks like rust. Because I'm cheap, I decided to work with 3mm MDF for the walls. In my uneducated opinion, I could cut it with a box cutter fairly easily while still keeping the walls flat. After cutting the MDF to the correct dimensions, I mapped out my left wall where I wanted the wall hole, the door and the break wall to go. On the back wall, I marked up the rough dimensions of the window and the door and the windows for the right wall. With the plan in place, I attempted to Dremel out the hole in the left wall. I realised the bit I was using was utter trash and taught myself how to cut holes in wood with the correct drill bit. With the wall details marked out, I primed the walls with Zinsser shellac primer. I knew I'd be painting over them with a heap of washes and paints, and I hoped it would be waterproof. I set about creating a raised doorway on the left wall. In a move that I will soon regret, I decided to use some softish foam I had left over from chair packaging as it was lightweight. I thought I would go over it with a thin coat of putty filler, and while I was at it, I'd use the same putty filler to subtly bulk the wall where the break wall would be carved. I had hoped the primer would prevent or reduce any water from the putty getting into the wall and warping it, and I left it to dry overnight with the heater on. Not only did the wall buckle, but the doorway cracked and crumpled. I decided I'd rather work with the devil I knew and cracked out an old bucket of hydrocal. I knew it would be strong even when thin and more likely to withstand painting pressure. With the doorway replastered and buckled wall a future me problem, I lightly sanded the hydrocal coat on the door, which resulted in some plaster coming away and cracking. ChatGPT searched the web and suggested a coat of acrylic matte medium to bind the surface, which I applied with a brush, and it worked. Thankfully, some much-needed comic relief arrived in the form of my Temu order. I had ordered some props hoping they would provide some easy decorative additions. The crutches, outlets and vents needed a little finessing, but the rest was... A few libations later, and it was time to sketch out a basic design for the breakaway wall. In Silent Hill 2 Remake, James works his way through various labyrinths via a breakaway wall with his melee weapon. Since this was a decorative and fun mechanic by Bloober, I wanted to include it here. Remember the plaster wall build-up? This was what it was for. With a rough design sketched out, I carved out a 3D crack design to represent this mechanic. The back wall inspiration was directly sucked from my main reference image. I love the idea that the window had been covered over with newspaper and scratched away by curious inmates, but inaccessible. I bought some cheap 2mm acrylic plates from Spotlight that were close to the window size and cut one down to, I guess, fit the window hole. But after airbrushing the back of the back wall flat black and hot gluing the acrylic plate, I wanted to add wire fencing to the window for decoration. I was going to coat it in lead belcher first, but I tried the Dirty Down Rust on its own and it looked pretty good. I then hot glued this in place. It was time to construct the windowsill and cage. I constructed the window frame from coffee sticks and glued them down with wood glue. Next, I had to tackle the bars. This was my first time working with styrene products, and oh my god was this tedious. All I had that might stick styrene to wood was 90-second araldite, which made the process a tad more difficult. I had bought 2mm H columns and 1.6mm rods, thinking that with 0.2mm on either side there'd be enough room to slot the rod into the gap in the H column and hold it in place better. So I sanded down the back of the H columns once cut to size, mixed up my quick set epoxy, and proceeded to awkwardly glue the column inside the edge of the frame. After that experience, I decided to make the windowsill, which was made out of coffee stirrers and hobby wood. I smoothed the flats and edges with sandpaper and glued them down with wood glue. Before I continued with the bars, I needed to add any final flourishes to the window. I found some miniature newspaper articles and printed them out, stained them with yellow acrylic to make them look aged, and then I layered the acrylic with PVC glue, laid the pieces back in order, ripping and smooshing them where it felt appropriate, and then grunged them up with some PPI grunge palette in dirt shades. After this lovely break of competence, it was time to get back to the bars. I read that I could bend the styrene rods with a little heat. How much heat was a bit vague. I developed a method of holding the rods in my hobby vise, heating the point of the bend until it collapsed, and forcing it into the wanted direction. This was a bit delicate as too much heat would melt the styrene, but not enough wouldn't do anything. I then had the pleasure of making sure the bends coordinated with the gaps in the H columns exactly. I did this both vertically and horizontally. This process took 2 days, partly because I didn't know how plastic cement works. It kind of melts the styrene and you got to wait till it grabs a bit before you let the styrene go. The right side wall was the simplest of the walls as I had minimal fancy footwork going on. I needed a gap for a pipe installed in the back corner, a doorway next to it, and a window that indicated the room next door was under construction with black plastic covering. I constructed the door frame from 2mm hobby wood, beveling the corners for interest. I began constructing the large window area to the right of the door with coffee stirrers and wood glue, and the same with the window over the door. At some stage, I decided the windowsill should follow the ground to work with the forced perspective. I also made a door out of hobby wood. For the large windows, I used a thin greengrocer bag cut open and airbrushed dark green black. The plastic needed to be thin enough to look appropriate at that scale. We'll get back to this once the wall's been painted. Finally, we get to painting the walls. I airbrushed all the backs and fronts of the walls with a mix of demineralised water, carbon black matte acrylic, and airbrush medium. I mixed up a metric ton of grey paint and roughly sponged this over the surface of the walls. With that dry, I attempted a mix of latex, gravel sand, grout mix, which promptly absorbed the latex and turned into a chunky sand ball. What I was trying to make was a texture paste that would allow me to paint over the top and once dry, peel it to look like peeling paint. I remade the mix with just sand and latex and dappled that over the walls, which worked as intended. Over the now dried latex sand, I stippled on various mixes of dark brown, red oxide and sienna paints with a lot of water as a wash. I applied this wash with a sea sponge that I pulled chunks out of to get an uneven deposit. I went back over the top of this with more red oxide to encourage that sort of otherworldly rust colour with both the sponge and the chip brush. I couldn't help myself and I began peeling the latex. One of the most satisfying painting techniques I used was this black wash dribble. I thinned some black acrylic with water and put it in a dropper, let it run down the walls. I may have liked this technique a little too much. I encouraged some streaks to run by spraying with some water and alcohol to break the surface tension. For some dirt and texture, I spattered the surface with my grunge palette, heaps of alcohol and a cut down chippy brush. This is an old favourite. It's great for breaking up plain surfaces. The only downside is it ruined my manicure. Because there's never too much of a good thing, and I just bought this product and I was dying to try it, I had to crack out the AK Streaking Grime. This is an enamel paint for scale models, but what I liked about it is its green, dark brown colour, which was a nice contrast against the red rust. But it also has a slight gloss or sheen, adding more texture. At this point, things were looking just a little bit flat, so I dry brushed all the edges of the doors, window frames, wall corners, door surfaces, and basically whatever was sticking out with Vallejo Buff acrylic paint. It was finally time to start painting the break wall. I began by adding the streaking grime to the cracks with a fine brush and went over it with white spirit. Since the break wall looks wet in-game, I mixed Temu black with their clear gloss and ran that through the cracks and also streaked it down for some more definition. I decided I wanted a grate over the hole on the left wall, so I got out my painter's tape, sketched a rough outline with a Sharpie and cut it to shape and adjusted it to fit. I super glued it in place, except when I went to paint it, the super glue gunked up my good brush. Thankfully, I have plenty of acetone, so the brush survived. I recalled a trick I'd seen Miscast do, which was to sprinkle baking soda over the super glue to make it set faster. It also has an added bonus of looking like swollen rusty bits. This was a good point to pause and check how well the colour of the wall and floor were coming together. I decided that the wall looked a little too pink and I just had to crack out my favourite rusty buddies. I began with the yellow rust and a broken sea sponge, which I dabbled in random places, and then repeated that with the regular rust colour. This process was applied to all of the other walls as well. At a later stage, I added a strip of styrene to the wall hole, which I painted black, followed by the rusties and some red ochre pigment powder. And finally, red oxide acrylic dry brush to make the whole pop. In my now grand tradition of overdoing everything, I wasn't done with this break wall yet. The drips just didn't look drippy enough, and I'd found some new reference images of the break wall and decided it wasn't accurate enough. Plus, the whole thing needed more contrast in my opinion. I added more black goo drips, mixing up a 50-50 ratio of the gloss and the black from Temu, and proceeded to dribble probably far too many drips of goo onto my break wall. I was finally happy with it and can let it go. Before we move on to the ceiling, I had to finish the right wall window plastic. I cut out a rough area to fit each part of the window, glued some wooden skewers to the upper and lower portions to keep the lines straight, and saturated the back with PVA glue. I then rolled the ends over for neatness, tucked it in or trimmed any daggy bits, and squished the plastic around with a cotton bud until it looked kind of right. Way back in the beginning, when I cut my ceiling out of cardboard and then MDF with holes for lights, I shoved Nursey into place on the floor and went, "That looks okay," without fully thinking it through. I realised I wanted the ceiling tiles to depreciate in depth as they reached the back wall to support the sense of scale. Later I tried to measure this out and found out that, in layman's terms, it no worky. So I figured out the angles were not the same as well, and that was bugging me too, so I decided I had to start the ceiling from scratch again. I cut out a new piece of MDF with matching angled sides, marked out the ceiling segments for the ceiling tiles in diminishing depth, with the front segments being deeper and wider, and the narrower and thinner ones towards the back. I cut out the corrected light holes with my Dremel, tidying up the lines with my sanding sticks, and then primed the surface with the Zinsser primer. While the primer dried, I cut out individual 3mm styrene strips. Going back to my original reference image, there are dark voids in the ceiling where the panels are broken down. I didn't want holes where light could get through or where I would need to cut another panel to replace on top, so I decided to Dremel the ceiling voids out. While this exercise was fun, and I did wear a mask, it spread a very fine layer of husband glitter all over my entire room. Not to be one to look a gift horse in the mouth, or whatever that saying is, I collected the fallout in a jar for future crafting purposes. After an extensive cleanup, I patched any oopsies from over-eager dremeling, primed the voids with a mix of PVA water and black acrylic ink, and I was careful not to get it on my white ceiling. It was time to glue the very many styrene strips to the ceiling. Styrene is apparently notorious for lifting, so I sanded the surface of the strips with a sanding block before applying weld bond with a brush and laying the strips in place, assisted by painter's tape. Back to the reference image, I noticed that there were some partially fallen panels that might add some much needed detail to an otherwise boring ceiling. I measured out 2 areas to add said panels and cut the styrene sheets to match. The smallest panel fit perfectly, but the closer panel was not quite long enough to fit the section I wanted. Due to the fact I am stubborn, I spent an embarrassing amount of time with a range of sandpapers grinding down one end of the styrene so that it would blend seamlessly into the surface. Once I had removed my fingerprints from my dominant hand, I proceeded to glue down the panels so that the fronts could be lifted away. I applied the weld bond on both surfaces and smoothed the thinned out edge with a silicone shaper. I had decided the black voids were not voidy enough, and since getting my hands on any version of Black 2.0 or 4.0 in Australia is nigh impossible or stupidly expensive, I tested my Blackest Matters paint and then worked some black oxide into the surface. And the results weren't bad. I wanted the ceiling to appear mouldy and derelict while still remaining light to contrast the all-rust environment. To keep the colours translucent, I broke out my trusty grunge alcohol palettes for some much-needed ageing and went to town. I kept the inks really diluted, letting them run into all the surface textures and tapped off any excess with a sponge. I added spatters and watermarks with an alcohol spray before dusting over parts with some more black oxide. To make the ceiling less stark next to the walls, I brushed the ceiling edges near the walls with some red oxide and burnt umber pigment powders with a loose soft brush. I then ran a thin acrylic black wash along the edges of the styrene strips for contrast. Times the fucking charm. It was a fucking nightmare. Bastards.